But what we're really talking about here, I think, is a conundrum, a dilemma, a problem even, because the UAE wants to decarbonize. It is now adamant that it sees the inevitability of decarbonization and renewables. But at the same time, the UAE also wants to increase capacity. Oil remains the lifeblood of the UAE economy. How does it satisfy those two aims, which are on the surface of it conflicting, it seems to me? So let's get a view specifically on that first, please, from our experts up here. Vandana, can the UAE square this circle? Can it keep producing oil or increasing capacity at the same time as decarbonizing?
Thank you very much, Frank, and good morning, everyone. The word pragmatic is probably what will resonate most if we look at consumers in Asia. The biggest, if you just look at blocks of consuming regions globally, the biggest consuming region for oil and gas, the fastest growing region as well, and expected to remain as such. Now, from my perch in Singapore, of course, I keep a very close ear to the ground as to what the sentiment is and has been in Asia, especially since, I would say, the late 2021 energy crisis that began. So this is pre-Ukraine war. You might recall gas prices went up quite a bit. It was the Europe gas and power crisis, which, of course, rippled across to gas and power and coal markets in Asia as well. So even before that, the feeling, it's almost a groundswell in Asia amongst major consuming countries. And here, of course, we tend to think of China and India, but I'm also talking of other Southeast Asian countries, which are also finding quite a rapid growth in energy demand. The groundswell of opinion and view with regard to transition has been, to put it very, very plainly, that yes, it is important. We do need to transition. Countries across Asia, maybe they do not have as ambitious targets for net zero as perhaps what we see in Europe and the US, but nonetheless, they have also pledged to get to net zero. It may be 2060. In the case of India, it's 2070. There alone, you see the start of pragmatism, because they say, even if we are going to have our targets, let's have realistic targets. But to get back to the oil and gas world, the fossil fuel world, and to the UAE specifically, what Asia wants, first of all, a big concern in Asia especially, is the huge drop in investments in oil and gas that we are seeing. Until a few years ago, Asia was being told, and this was the received wisdom in Asia, that gas is the natural transition fuel.
That's right, yeah.
The bridging fuel, right? And now suddenly you find, consumers in Asia find that, at least if they listen to what's happening, being talked about in the Western world, that gas is bad as well. So gas and oil are being lumped together. Do not invest in oil, do not invest in gas either, which leaves them in a very, very strange, bad predicament. Because in Asia, actually, countries all the way from major economies like China and India to Southeast Asian economies, even countries that have traditionally been gas exporters, LNG exporters, have been putting up LNG import terminals because they had designed their energy strategy over the next 10, 15, 20 years on the basis that we will transition from coal, yes, and now I drop in that dirty word, coal, to gas, right? And what we have seen over the past 2 years, at least over the past 1.5 years, is that Asia has doubled down on coal because, again, it doesn't have a choice. So the overarching message that you get from Asia is, and it's getting louder and louder, and I think I'm pretty sure it will be heard clearly at COP28, is that we need oil and gas, we need oil and gas investment, we need stability of supply, energy affordability and accessibility is crucial for Asia. Otherwise, you're going to have exactly as what happened last year with regard to transition, you're going to have one step forward, 2 steps back.
Right.
So when countries like India, China, other emerging Asian economies look at, for instance, UAE saying that we are still committed, we will increase our crude production, that puts the UAE amongst a handful of countries globally that actually have a plan.
So that goes down well with Asian consumers.
It absolutely. Right. It is very, very reassuring.
Okay.
So I think then the next step, of course, is how does the UAE, because within Asia as well, they would also want to hear, yes, you are going to increase your crude production, which is very reassuring. That's exactly what we want, because we think oil, gas, and unfortunately even coal will be needed for the foreseeable future. But can you do it in a low carbon manner? So I think what the UAE can be reassured of is that it has full support from the largest, fastest energy demand growth region of the country, of the world, that they should invest, they should increase. But I think what they need to now figure out is how to do so by at the same time reducing their carbon footprint. So of course, we can talk a little more about what tools are available to do that.
I think you made a very good point there, which is that the UAE's dilemma is in many ways the world's dilemma. Because the world also wants to decarbonize. I think there is a general consensus on that, but the world also wants the economic growth, which has been associated and which I think will continue to be associated with hydrocarbons. Robin, what do you think about the UAE's predicament here?
Frank, you talk about squaring the circle. I think there's a square and there's a circle, and they're not the same thing, right? You've got the square, which is domestic decarbonisation, which the UAE is progressing on and has plans, and we're doing a lot of work on this at the moment, and I'll tell you these are very credible plans and very achievable. I actually think the UAE can get to net zero probably a lot easier and quicker than many other countries. And then you've got the oil production side, which is the circle, and that applies to the outside world. The outside world is demanding a certain amount of oil. And the whole point of the Paris Agreement structure is you have these nationally determined contributions, and they're national. Every country says, what are we going to do nationally to reduce our emissions? Not what are we going to do to other countries to make them reduce their emissions. And so that's the division of responsibility. And the UAE produces oil, it exports oil, and it's up to other countries to use that oil or not use that oil or find alternatives for it. And put the counterfactual here. If the UAE were to say, okay, we're not going to increase production, we're going to cut production, in a kind of a net zero trajectory and go to zero by 2050. You will see President Biden and several others around here, and no doubt Prime Minister Modi and others will be here around here very, very quickly and saying, "What are you doing? Give me decarbonisation, but not yet." So the next few years, I think, is a very different thing from the 2050 outlook. And even with the Europeans, you saw this, of course. As soon as the Ukraine war broke out, European ministers, even Minister Habeck from the Green Party was here, and he was in Abu Dhabi, he was in Qatar, asking, "Give me more oil and gas." We need it right now. Longer term, no, but right now we do. So this imperative of short-term energy security and energy affordability is a critical one, alongside the also critical but longer-term perspective of getting to net zero. And I think if you look around the oil producers, and Vandana makes this point, you have some producers that are going to grow production. That's the UAE. Probably that's proportionally the biggest. Saudi, maybe Iraq, maybe a few other new entrants like Ghana and so on. But you have many more countries where production is going to be flat or declining, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when I think Russian production is now also set to be starved of investment and hit by sanctions and so on, and set for kind of.
Although it hasn't really happened yet, has it? Sorry, we will come back to the geopolitics of it towards the end. Sorry.
It's a good point. I certainly would like to address it.
We will. Yeah. We will, sure.
But anyway, though, the point is there are not many countries that are credibly planning to increase production significantly, and the UAE is probably the biggest of them. If you look at what global decline rates are, average global decline rate without reinvestment in fields at all is on the order of 8%. With reinvestment in existing fields, it's on the order of 4%. And yet, even in kind of peak demand scenarios, you're looking at a couple of % decline per year. So there's still a need for new investment and new oil production to fill that gap, even in a world where oil demand overall is declining.
Right. Thanks, Robin. Squares and circles, that's a good point. Bill, let me move to perhaps a more transatlantic view, although I know that you've lived and worked in Asia and the Middle East for many years now too. But give us a global view here, or firstly, a view on the UAE's position. Suhail Al-Mazroui in Riyadh over the weekend, yesterday, in fact, was trying to make it very clear that the planned increase was of capacity, not of production. Going from 3 million barrels to 5 million barrels was capacity. And he said, we need this capacity in case anything goes wrong with energy transition. We need this to fall back on. Mm-hmm. Now, that would, I'm sure that would draw sighs of disbelief from the Guardian newspaper and from other environmentalists. So, Bill, you know the UAE very well too. What is their position here? Is it sustainable?
Yeah, I think I agree with Robin that domestically and in their what they call scope 1 and 2 emissions, in country, what they can control. If pragmatic means kind of not too fast, not too slow, I think actually the UAE is quite aggressive in that sense. I think they're moving beyond. They're moving in the fast lane in terms of their own decarbonization of both the country, but of the oil and gas sector. But when you get abroad, yeah, I think that's where, I think they're taking a pragmatic approach in the sense that it does feel like a reasonable bet that there's going to be some space to grow production. There feels like broadly in the world, we're seeing a bit of a division of labor between the international oil companies, the private, the Exxon Mobils, the Chevrons, that I think are going to be and already are reluctant to invest in big long-term, super long-term projects. They're certainly spending all their time returning money to shareholders in the form of dividends and buybacks, because their investors were not very happy with their performance in the recent past. So I think, they'll maybe focus on some interim, midterm stuff. You've seen Exxon looking to buy Pioneer here in the last couple of days. That's clearly a kind of play for some production increase but that could also be scaled back pretty much. That leaves the national oil companies probably to bear the burden, and probably rightfully so, to the extent they can do it, is the cleanest, greenest,
cheapest
oil and gas production, and the cheapest oil and gas production. That makes a certain amount of sense. And at the end of the day, will that pragmatism, I think, there are many paths for many different players and all that, and they're all going to have to adjust to the pace of the energy transition. And, right now, as Vandana says, demand is booming in Asia, and is kind of holding reasonably steady in many other places. But it's not altogether clear that's where things are going to go. So to the extent they're talking about just capacity, maybe that's a decent play. That might be pragmatic. I just think that, my sense is over the longer term, clearly the risks are on the downside for the market. And so you just got to figure out how you're going to play that. And it's entirely possible that Gulf producers could play that by, making sure that they're there to supply what demand exists, even in a market.
Right, and being falling. The last barrel standing,
and kind of ride that curve down. That makes a certain amount of sense. Now, of course, that if you're hosting COP, that bumps into the realities of climate math, stock take, and what I think of as the press of policy, which is really ratcheting up around the world. The IRA in the U.S., the European stuff, and I think those policies are driven really by a combination of energy security concerns in the case of China. So you're seeing China add gobsmacking levels of renewable energies, basically from a energy security standpoint, and then the IRA in the U.S. and the EU, I think, are driven in significant part by anxiety about the climate impacts.
Yeah,
and to what extent will those ratchet up, and to what effect they'll have on demand.
Thanks, Bill. You have given me a nice little segue there, exactly into my next section, which is about COP28. But I want to try and dig deep into this now and see what we're expecting, what these expert people here think will happen, what are the possible outcomes. But I have another question for you before we go into the panel discussion here. So another show of hands, please. Who amongst you thinks that it was wrong for the United Nations to ask the UAE, an oil-producing country, to host a climate change conference and for Dr. Sultan Al Jaber to be present? Who thinks it was wrong? Raise your hand if you think that was wrong. Fantastic show of solidarity. Let's just talk about that very briefly, because there has been an awful lot of coverage on this, Vandana, hasn't there? And the poor old guy poor young guy has had a bad time in lots of Western media. Is it justified? What's your take on this?
I think it's a confluence of two things. One is, of course, I think as we know, it didn't go down well with the whole part of the world, his being appointed to that role. And somehow I think it came at a time when increasingly we were seeing much combative divergence of views. It was around, he was named in January, right? And it's around last year that we started hearing the term the Global South and what the Global South wants. So we're seeing, the two, and then the jet piece, and, where some countries have had pledged to help other emerging economies to get over their addiction of coal. I don't know if addiction is their reliance on coal. Like Indonesia recently, Indonesia was saying that none of that money has been coming through because nobody wants to help the countries, the few rich nations that had come together to help Indonesia retire some of the coal-fired power plants. And, the new ones, it's not easy to retire them because the investors say, hang on, we haven't got our money back yet. So who's going to pay to retire a coal-fired plant that's not at the end of its life, right? So coming back to Sultan Al Jaber, I think increasingly when I ask people...
It doesn't have to be him personally, by the way.
I was just going to go into the very personal.
Do, yes, please. Okay, then.
Increasingly in events like this one, and we had the APEC event, major oil conference in Singapore last month, when I asked people not about Sultan Al Jaber's leadership, but just about COP28, increasingly, I get a shake of the head, a shrug of the shoulders, the people just getting quite pessimistic, right, cynical even. So
cynical as to the outcome,
it's a dumpster fire. Right. It's like there's people, voices representing nations. You have African countries, and I know it feels like I'm going all over the place with this answer, but that is the picture, right? And you have African countries, you have new oil frontiers opening up in African nations, and they are saying we have every right to develop our oil and gas. After you've developed yours and after you put out all those emissions, you're telling us now to let the oil wealth that we found under the ground to let it remain there. So I'll round that up. But so how does Sultan Al Jaber? So the reason I'm laying this out is that it would have been a very probably the toughest COP for anyone to take over, right? And we put a sort of a cat among the pigeons on top of that by naming him and rattling more than half of the world. But personally, the message that I have seen coming out of from him and out of some of the recent meetings around, how can we snatch some success out of the jaws of pessimism over COP28 is he's saying that he wants to rally national oil companies and international oil companies to pledge
in this
decarbonization targets.
Yeah.
Yes. And he may not be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat. I think we all need to be pragmatic and about that as well. But as long as he's putting that message out there, I think really it would be in the oil and gas sector's favor, whether nationally or as companies, to get in line with that. I think that's a great, and my bit of perspective on that also is I think they should focus on just the scope 1. Not try and, let not the perfect be the enemy of the good. How can oil companies be held responsible for scope 2, scope 3? Are we trying to do too much, boil the ocean? So stick to scope 1, ask oil and gas companies, can you pledge to decarbonize your operations, to curtail methane emissions and methane leaks from your... So I think if that comes out of it, out of COP28, I think he will have rescued this a very bad situation.
Bill, sorry, just before I ask Bill's opinion, interestingly, in Riyadh yesterday, Dr. Sultan pointed out that of the previous 27 COPs, 17 had been held in fossil fuel producing countries, which I didn't know. He reeled this out on stage. I thought it was quite a good point. Bill, what do you think? Has he had a bad press at the hands of this, the green media in Europe and North America?
I think a lot of this was to be expected. I'm not sure they fully expected it, surprisingly. But of course, this is the kind of criticism you're going to get. Maybe it would have been smarter if he had stepped down for a year or something from
ADNOC.
Perhaps, but they still would have gotten plenty of criticism that wouldn't have solved the problem, if you want to consider that.
There was a story in The Guardian over the weekend that he didn't want to do that because he was worried about the palace coup while he was away from ADNOC. You see this? I mean, they really are.
Perhaps, and that would not have, really would have tempered the criticism only slightly. You still would have the fundamental issue of a major oil producer planning to expand production hosting a COP.
Of course, yeah.
So that was always going to be difficult. I think, the important thing is we don't know whether it's going to be a mistake or not, right? I think if they can't really get anything that can be called a success at COP, then I think people will conclude that was a big mistake.
Okay.
Now, if they can get some sort of agreements that look pretty good and can be called a success, there's not going to be a worldwide agreement on the phase down, phase out of fossil fuels. But for example, I mean, they certainly could put together a credible financing package that could be blended with a strong commitment to triple renewables, with a financial package that looked like that could make it happen, particularly in the developing world. Where the needs are great. And I think the biggest thing I'd say is if he could get some sort of strong agreement and statement from broadly on methane, that would go an awfully long way. Awfully long. That is probably the single biggest thing the oil and gas industry could do on their own terms in the short term that would make a huge difference and buy a huge amount of space over the next 5 to 7 years. So if they could get that sort of agreement, I think that would be a major step forward for But I'm not sure he's going to even pull that off.
I want to dig deep into the possible outcomes of COP in a moment. But Robin, let me ask you. The FT said several months ago now that, or it posed the question whether COP28 will be a flop. What does a flop look like in this context? I'm trying to understand the rationale behind that headline. This is a gathering of parties, isn't it? If it's a flop, then that means the parties have failed. It doesn't mean the presidency has failed. Or have I got that wrong? Am I also being too much in solidarity with the UAE?
So nobody put their hands up, right? So I don't need to defend Dr. Sultan here, and he can do it very ably himself. I think that they were surprised by the criticism that they got, and as Bill says, they probably shouldn't have been, but but they were. But I think in terms of the flop, it's a thankless task, right? You've got these 160 odd countries that you have to kind of somehow corral into a common position, and you've got a couple of major countries there who have very divergent opinions and are not going to go the way you want, and you have really no ability to demand that or to compel them to do that. So that's absolutely true. As a president, you can run the event well and you can make sure the diplomacy goes well and so on, but 95% is out of your hands. We've seen past events. Copenhagen was one good example. I mean, Denmark generally thought of as a very green company. Copenhagen COP was a disaster and ended in failure and recriminations and so on. That was because China and the US disagreed, and there were some real failures in the approach of both governments in those countries, and they just didn't see eye to eye at all. No, not the fault of the Danes, but unfortunately they got landed with a fiasco. So things like that can happen. And when we think about, as you say, Frank, how many fossil fuel producing countries have hosted COPs? Which countries hosted more COPs than any other? Germany, 3 or 4, I think. And everyone looks at Germany as this green paragon, but Germany is a huge coal miner, and it's going to be mining coal well into the 2030s. So there's a real perception versus reality of who's actually green on hosting these things. If this COP had been taken away from the UAE and given to Germany, nobody would have raised objections.
Yeah.
And yet, coal facts, it looks equally as bad.
If I can add one thing to that, I think COPs are important, especially since Paris. I think they're important, but they are not the energy transition. And I think people have to really remember that, the COP process was dominated, I think, mainly by the kind of climate activist crowd. For a long time, they saw that as their tool to try to accelerate the energy transition, and they found it a very ineffective and frustrating tool to make that happen. And I think you've seen in the last couple of years, the oil and gas industry, as the energy transition itself has gained momentum, the oil and gas industry has really seen the need to engage in that process, try to bring it along on terms they like better, that can work for them. Doesn't mean they're all against transition, but that often takes the form of trying to slow it down somewhat and make it work in their favor. I suspect they will find that the COP tool is equally ineffective and frustrating tool for trying to slow down or manipulate.
The oil and gas industry mean that?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's whether COP's a success or not is one question. It's not unimportant, but it is not the energy transition, which is kind of proceeding on its own pace with dynamics that are really not all that affected, frankly, by climate diplomacy.
Okay. And I think you make a very good point there. Bill, and I wanted to say this before. The answer to setting a very, very stringent target at COP and not meeting it is not to set an even more stringent target at the next COP.
Right.
It's to say, why did we not hit that stringent target? What are the policy barriers, economic barriers, whatever barriers stopping us? And how do we tackle those? That's the practical approach. And we'll no doubt discuss that when we look at specific outcomes.
Well, let's do that now, Robin, because I wanted to try and dig a bit deeper here and work out what your views are on what the possible outcomes might be. Firstly, what are your expectations? I knew you were at ADIPEC last week. I wasn't there, but I'm sure there was a lot of discussion about COP there. What's the kind of consensus, and what do you think? What is possible?
So I think the UAE has steered this quite cleverly towards things that are going to work for them, and I think there's a few angles on that. Bill mentions methane. That's absolutely critical, but honestly, the oil industry should have been doing that 10 years ago. And I said the same to people at ADIPEC. We're only now getting serious on methane, one of the easiest things to tackle in terms of climate. But okay, fine. If there's a global agreement on methane and much tougher action on that, okay, that's good, I guess. But that's to me, in my mind, a pretty low bar. I think the UAE has stood it quite well to say, okay, we've been criticised for being an oil-producing country. Okay, let's put the criticism back in a nice way, but on the developed countries. You've promised all this money for climate and development in Africa, particularly in lower-income countries in general, and you haven't delivered. Okay, so let's see some delivery on that. If you're going to criticise things that we do. So that's a big area. A proper agreement on climate finance. Not because that climate finance really 100 billion. Is that really transformational itself?
It's not, though, is it? In terms of the energy transition cost.
No, it's not. But it's more, I think, about getting a symbolic victory. Yeah. There's you had some responsibilities. You live up to those. So that's I think important for that reason. Although the practical impact is not so much. And another critical area I look at is all this question of, we're going to phase out fossil fuels, phase down. I mean, that's kind of meaningless language in a way. As Bill says, it doesn't really commit anybody to do anything. But what is important is, okay, if we agree, yes, we're going to phase out unabated fossil fuels, that gives a very strong signal for carbon capture and storage, which is a critical thing for the UAE and the Middle East in general. And if that can be included in the so-called Article 6, the carbon trading provisions, and you could trade reductions from carbon capture and storage the same as you trade reductions from renewables and things today, that would allow finance to flow into carbon capture. That's incredibly important and a very helpful thing for the UAE and other major oil producers. So that's a thing I think they would also like to steer towards. And then tripling renewables. I think that's a good one because everybody wants triple renewables. The Guardian will love that. And the UAE is well on the way to tripling renewables itself. So that's a target the UAE can be pretty confident that it will hit on the current trajectory. So that also looks like a win for everybody.
Right. But the phasing down versus phasing out debate, that I think is what inevitably Western media will focus on anyway, isn't it? They will accuse the participants of some sort of fudge, some sort of failure, flop, because they didn't have the word out there. They only had the word down there. That's how it strikes me. But Vandana, you have already mentioned the prominence that coal and other hydrocarbons have in Asia. So for Asian countries, Asian consumers looking at this COP, what would be their favoured outcome?
Yeah, so let's start with coal. Asian countries want to move away from coal as well, but we know that secure, stable, affordable energy supply capable of supporting economic growth is paramount for all of them. And no leader in the region is mincing words on that. So when a lot of the countries were forced, unfortunately, to go back to using more coal last year because Europe was sucking in all the LNG, paying the top dollar for it. And a lot of the countries, and increasingly that region, we have to remember now, is becoming more and more dependent on LNG imports. A few of the countries have secured their base load in term contracts, but a lot of them haven't. And up to 30% of dependence remains on the spot market. And countries like Pakistan, for instance, couldn't buy a single spot LNG cargo. A lot of them suffered brownouts, blackouts, industries had to shut down. So a lot of countries in Asia paid, even after doubling down on coal use, paid a very heavy price for last year's energy crisis, which doesn't get covered at all. I noticed in the Western media and the international media, which was focusing on what's happening in Europe. So the message from Asia, and they'll not say it openly because the right thing to say for the political leaders is that we want to phase out coal. But the message clearly ringing out of Asia is that if they have to use coal to make sure that their populations don't become more energy poor, their economies don't suffer, they will use. So I think that's a message that the whole world needs to hear very, very clearly coming out of Asia. They're not going to change. They're not going to say, we'll shut down our industries. And
as we saw during the oil price spike after the Ukraine invasion, in China and India.
Yeah. They're producing more coal. They're using more coal. China has pulled out all the stops. Back in 21, you might recall, China had actually issued quotas to its coal miners that you may not exceed, and they were being very strictly implemented. All of that has gone out the window. Now coal producers, and not just that, they are now mining the dirtiest coal possible because the government is looking the other way, or maybe even telling them through back channels that it's fine. Dig out all the coal you can. From the earth. So unfortunately, this is the price that Asia has paid. Now, yes, people talk about carbon abatement in coal, in power generation using coal. The thing is that technology is not that common. It is super expensive. What I understand is that what China is doing is it's retiring a lot of its old coal-fired power plants. A lot of attention in media goes to, China is permissioning record coal-fired power plant in 2022 and is expected to beat that record, set another record in 2023. What a lot of those reporters miss out on is that they're also retiring a lot of the old coal-fired. And the reason for that is that to put carbon capture equipment and technology, it's much better to do it with a new,
from scratch,
with economies of scale, a bigger power plant than to try and retrofit an old plant. So China is doing that. But for the vast majority of Asia, it's just not affordable. Okay. So in the end, so what does all of this mean? at the very least, Asia needs reliable, affordable, stable supply of natural gas. It's a very important transition fuel. Lots of countries in Asia were gas producers for decades, exporters as well. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines had a major. All of those gas reservoirs are running out. They've suffered a double whammy because the oil majors have exited, and all the burden has fallen on the national oil companies, which were, whether financially or technology-wise, weren't really ready to pick up all that slack. So that's the reality on the ground in Asia.
Okay, thanks. Bill, I'm not trying to pigeonhole you as an American, but it strikes me that the American situation here is especially interesting. We've seen the huge IRA investment with all of that means for renewables. But at the same time, American shale production keeps on going up, keeps on increasing. America is now the biggest producer in the world, I believe. Is that right, Robin? Yeah?
Yep.
So, that seems almost kind of schizophrenic to me. What do Americans want from COP? What would satisfy America? These two
Which Americans?
Yeah,
is the
exactly.
answer to that question. I think America is obviously a huge fossil fuel producer, the biggest in the world, really, when you add them all up. So, I think there's certainly lots of mixed opinion. Right now, the Democrats and Biden are running the show, and their clear preference is to both continue to produce all those things, but also put in a lot of incentives to push an energy transition forward, largely with carrots, very few, if any, sticks. There's a little bit of a stick with methane. And so that's the path they've chosen in terms of COP. I think they would probably get on board with a phase down of abated fossil fuels, simply because that's, you really think about it, kind of like, what's an energy? If that doesn't happen, well, then what the heck is an energy transition? So, I think the U.S. will basically push in that direction to the extent it pushes. And my sense on COP basically is, if I had to do a little scorecard, I'd say if they get a methane agreement that's strong, if there's a agreement to triple renewables with some sort of solid baseline and target date, and a financing package that goes well beyond the $100 billion is purely like the developed world has to just get that monkey off its back. Right. It's been a pathetic and just awful.
Yeah, it's
awful.
A multi-year-old number,
Ridiculous.
Isn't it?
And now $100 billion gets you, basically, that's chump change to get in the game.
Yeah.
Or barely that even. So it's really more, can the UAE, and this is obviously their forte, can they put together a kind of global financing package that will be underpinned with not only their own commitments, but the really strong relationships they've built financially and politically with countries around the world. So if they can do anything, they can certainly do that. That could bolster the tripling of renewables, get a methane agreement. And then on fossil fuels, no agreement, but you've really already seen the window shift. At the beginning of the year, Dr. Sultan was talking, a lot of the language was about, well, we've got to build out the new energy system before we can switch to before we can switch over to it, as if somehow we're going to build the whole thing out and flip a switch at the end and switch over. Now, they've gotten their language, I think they always understood this, but their language has gotten much, much more, whatever you want to describe it. Now the language is very much, it's inevitable if we triple renewables that you'll start to see fossil fuels decline. And in the last week or so, I feel like I've seen some quotes from the leadership team that's really gone almost a little bit beyond that to saying that's a desirable thing to see happen.
The tone has shifted, hasn't it?
So, obviously, there will be people unhappy with the fact that there's not an agreement on fossil fuel, phase out, phase down, whatever. That's their job. They might well be right if you look at the climate numbers. But I think generally the UAE would come out looking pretty good if they could pull off that much.
Tell me, what number would really wow the world? What number would assuage the environmentalists and let them forget about phase out and phase down?
Well, again, there's keep in mind
That's round
that
trillion.
there are people's jobs to continue to push oil and gas production as far and as much as they can, and there are people whose jobs there should never be satisfied. And again, look at the climate math; they may not be wrong, but you're never going to satisfy them in terms of a result. But I don't know; I can't put a number on it. But I think there are people who can kind of add up what would you need to maybe Robin's done some work on this. What would you need to triple renewables broadly and make a kind of a meaningful down payment on that, do you think? You'd know better than I would.